Today we're going to take a look at seaming crochet pieces together. There's a few different ways to do it, but what I'm going to work here is called a flat seam. And that's good for working two pieces together that are going to be viewed on both sides because it doesn't leave an obvious seam on one side or the other. It looks the same on both sides. So I've got a granny square and a piece of crochet fabric that's been worked in rows, and it's just for demonstration purposes. I've got a contrast color of yarn here. If you're working a seam for a scarf or a blanket or something, obviously you'd want to try to match one of these colors, match it as close as you can so that the seam becomes a little less visible. But for our purposes, we're doing a contrast color so that you can see it. So I'm going to begin at the edge here. Now this is the last round that I've worked on my granny square, and this is the last row that I worked on my rows of crocheting. So this is I'm joining the two tops together. So I'm just going to insert my needle. So you thread a large eyed needle with your yarn. I'm inserting that into my first stitch, and I'm doing that under. So I'm working from the back to the front on the left side piece. And I'm going to pull this through and I'm going to leave a tail. Now, you can secure this with a knot if you would like. What I like to do is just leave this tail and weave it in later. If you think you're going to end up pulling it through and making a mistake as you pull it all the way through as you're sewing along, then you can just tie this with a loose knot and undo it later. I just don't like to put knots in my work in case you need to take it apart later, but it's unimportant. So I've worked from the back to the front on my left side piece. Now I'm going to work from the front to the back on my right side piece. So I'm going to find my corner stitch and insert my needle through both loops like I would when I'm crocheting into a stitch. And I'm going to pull that through. I'm not going to pull it very tightly so that you can see as I work along, and I also don't want to pull through that tail. So now I'm back to the left hand side. I'm working under. So I'm going from back to front through the next stitch, and then from front to back on my right side piece. So you just need to be consistent. If you're left-handed, you might be doing it the other way around. But as long as one piece is going from back to front, I hope you can see that. And then from front to back on this side. I'm just going to work a few more stitches so that we can take a look at the back side. Now, once you really get going, you can kind of go from front to back over here and then from back to front over here, all in one motion. With a little practice, you can get pretty quick at this. There we have our seam. So if I pull both ends, you can see it's pretty tight there. Now if this was a color that matched, it would blend in quite nicely. It wouldn't be quite so obvious, but you can see this seam on this side, if I flip it over, it looks exactly the same on this side. And that's what really makes a flat seam. It means that it's flat, there's no ridge on either side, and it's fairly reversible. Now I'm going to show you how to work a flat seam if you're seaming two pieces together that are, this is the side of my work, my side edge, and this is the top edge of this motif. So I've got a nice neat line of the tops of my stitches here, but on this side, I've got SEs and DCs. It's not quite as consistent as working one stitch into another stitch. So let me show you how to do that. I'm going to join my yarn. I've got my contrast yarn here. Again, you would want to match the yarn color if this was the project you're working on. I'm starting on the left. I'm going to work from back to front through that first stitch. And I'm going to leave a tail to weave in later. Again, this is just my way of doing things. I like to leave the tail and weave it in later. You could secure it with a knot if you're worried about pulling it all the way through. So as before, we're just going to work underhand on the left side, overhand on the right side. So I'm going to insert my needle into a stitch on the right from front to back, top to bottom. And then when I'm working into the side of my stitches here, there isn't really a great rule. You just need to be consistent and work in relatively the same line as you go along. So this is a DC stitch. I'm just going to sort of split that stitch and insert my needle somewhere in the center of that work and pull my yarn through. So on this side, I've got my nice neat stitches. That's easy. I'll just insert my needle from front to back through that next stitch, pull it through. And then on the left-hand side, I'm just going to find a place, so I'm putting it right through the stitch. So on the right, it's from front to back, and on the left, it's from back underneath to front. Now, well, I'm going to work one more before showing you something else you can do. This is a DC, so there's actually some space between the stitches. You could work all the way around that stitch rather than inserting your needle into the center. I don't like to do that just because it can gape. You can pull on that stitch and you can end up with a line of holes as you go along. And maybe that's something that you are doing as a design feature. You don't mind the look of that. Personally, I just like to secure it right in the center of that stitch. These are SCs and DCs on this left-hand side. So I'm just sort of finding a consistent place near the edge to insert my needle. And one thing I should mention, when you want your top and bottom edge of your seam, if you're putting two pieces together that you really want to line up, if you have the tops of your stitches and you're matching stitch to stitch, you're not going to run into too many problems. But for something like this, you might want to first add some safety pins to keep your pieces lined up before you start working your seam. But that's about it. And this is the same. It will work exactly the same if you're working into your foundation edge or you're joining two pieces together that are working into the sides. So that's your flat seam. Again, it looks pretty much the same on both sides. It just butts those edges right up against each other. And that's it for our flat seam.